No, we like Kavita said, we have. I think most of us would have, opposed or not opposed, but have had different opinions on the way architects have approached sites, especially the sloping ones, the more challenging ones. Having said that, we do understand that architects also operate under tremendous limitations.
Hi guys, welcome to the seventh episode of the Architectural Trap Faraway sessions. And I know you guys know that we haven't been uploading for a long time, and that's because we had lost internet connection because of this massive storm which hit our city. And now, since the connections are back, we are actively looking to put up new shows for you guys weekly. We have already introduced the two other shows which are running on Architectural Trap. You can check it out somewhere over here in one of the cards that I have placed. Otherwise, we are happy to get back into it, and in this episode we will be discussing about landscape architecture. It's a pleasure for me to introduce today's guest to you. We start with Ms. Shilpa Chandvarkar, who is the principal architect of SGC Design. She's a landscape architect and an active member of ISOLA, which is the Indian Society of Landscape Architects, and she's also a faculty of IES College of Architecture in Mumbai. We also have with us Ms. Kavita Jain, who is the principal architect of JRA Design based out of Gurgaon. She is a practicing landscape architect for many years and also an activist for green infrastructure approach to design. Finally, we also have Mr. Sujoy Das, who is a practicing landscape architect in the city of Kolkata. He is the principal architect of Inscape Design and has worked on multiple landscape projects. For all those of you who want to know more about them and companies, I have linked all the websites in the description. Please feel free to check out their works on their websites. Let me know in the comment section if there's anything that you specifically love and you have to ask a question. Let us start by asking you people who are practicing architects from different cities, what is landscape architecture and what are the similarities and differences between you and what we call an architect?
So in India, because of the way the education system goes, every landscape architect is first an architect.
Right.
Okay, yeah, the qualification is that you need to be an architect. So the biggest added qualification when you become a landscape architect is you become a much more sensitive architect, because you start thinking beyond building something. You start thinking of what you are building on. You start thinking of how it relates to your surroundings, how it affects society, how it affects natural and human forces. So that's the first thing. I mean, it's a very valuable contribution that you are making to being an architect by becoming a landscape architect. So that's the first thing I would like to say. Second thing is, sometimes, at least I speak for myself, the subject is so enamoring that it may take you away from the core field of architecture, because it I feel it offers you also an alternate way of looking at things. So you may become a very sensitive architect, or you may slightly move away from the field of architecture. So I think maybe Sujoy can talk on that, because he's much closer to. I mean, I'm a converted landscape architect.
Indranil, if you say, I mean, if you look at the description of landscape architect, as per the American Society of Landscape Architects, landscape architecture is a profession that designs, plans, and manage our land and its resources. Okay, so it's very clear to you that landscape architecture is a multidisciplinary field incorporating aspects of different fields like botany, horticulture, okay, fine arts, architecture, definitely industrial design and soil science, and most importantly that geography and ecology. Okay, so this is the basic thing. And now, Kavita ma'am, you can add the description of landscape architect.
I think what is perceived, when it is taught in college, is that it is architecture of the open spaces. or the external spaces. And yet they do attempt to give us an all-round kind of an exposure. Like I remember while doing our masters, we had a subject called geology, then horticulture, then but these were still limited exposure to these other kind of subjects, but I think while practicing, what I understood is that actually landscape architecture goes much beyond, and the true significance lies in actually understanding man's place on earth itself, you know to understand that
Yes.
we are like our species is basically part of the web of life. So it is
Right.
not the way we have come to perceive that human beings have to dominate everything else. But I think when we start to understand that what is our place in this web of life, then I think you start to actually educate yourself as to what landscape architecture is actually about. So I would probably let it circulate again, because it can make me go into a bit more philosophical kind of exploration, which I think is crucial, because ultimately it's our mind, and our minds and hearts, which actually enable us to manifest in the actual, in terms of concrete expression. So, what we understand in the depths of our minds and hearts, that is what we actually try to practice or express. So, I think that is very important for us to understand the source of understanding. And truly speaking, I feel that the way education of landscape architecture or architecture is, it is still limited, So, we need
Right.
to at this point of time, we need to be very open to educating ourselves from our own perceptions and our own wisdom and understanding of things around us.
So,
Yes.
before we move on, I'll just ask Shilpa ma'am what she meant when she said she's a converted landscape architect, and what that was.
So, can I be very frank?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely, as frank as possible.
No, the thing is, see, when I started my practice as a landscape architect, I used to be called upon to, green up a finished building a week before the inauguration, and it should look good. There should be flowers. There should be, I mean, everything should be ready made. And I did that for a few projects. After a while, when you also become a little bolder, you tell your clients that you can't call me a week before. The engagement needs to be much more. Then you start commenting on the site itself, the location of the building, the slopes, the water flow, the surface water flow. Is when you also realize, and your clients also realize, that there's much more that you bring to the table than just greening a site. And after
Right.
some time, you realize that you can build anything anywhere in 3 months, 4 months, 8 months, a year, but you really have to work very hard to have this nice green space, this forest, these trees. uh, I mean, and after some time, I think the building just loses value. It can be anywhere. It's okay. Anybody can build it. So I stopped designing buildings. I moved on to being a full scale landscape architect, because I think it just gave me a lot more satisfaction to do that, because it is just not about, it's about people. It's what you see out of your window. It's what you walk out into, what you walk in from. Just so many, you see seasons. I mean, your building looks the same for the next 100 years, and you can be very proud about it. But your tree can be blooming 3 months of the year. It can be dry 3 months of the year. It can be green 6 months of the year. There's just so much pleasure in designing with nature. So that's what I mean when I say I'm converted. I don't design buildings anymore. I don't see the need to
Yes,
design buildings
absolutely,
anymore.
ma'am. I just wanted to add one thing that
Yeah.
see, by the nature of job, architects have to create build form with steel, concrete, and destroying nature. But for us
Yeah.
as a landscape architect, our professional duty is to enhance greenery. Okay, plants trees, bring nature back into built environment, and in the way we are contributing to the environment for its betterment. This very fact is one of the most satisfying, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you'll always find us smiling more than other professionals.
So, when you're saying about the built environment or even the urban fabric, what do you think is the biggest significance that landscape architect can add? And also, as an added part to that question, given the current situation of the lockdown and the COVID-19 pandemic that is happening, what do you think can be a relief that landscape architecture can add in the lives during and post the lockdown?
Okay, I won't talk about the lockdown, but your first question about, in the urban scenario, landscape in the urban scenario. So I think in the first place, this urban scenario has come because we have ignored the landscape. In the sense, we didn't really look at the rivers, the streams, the nalas, the existing forests, the existing greens. We first just leveled off everything, built our buildings, roads, flyovers, and then we started searching back or looking again for, how do you bring green into it. So I think the first error is if you ignore, or rather, if you don't ignore the natural systems, you wouldn't be having to search for this, how do I now green my cities? They would have been green even otherwise. So, having said that, it's good business for us that cities need landscape architects. But right now, the main thing that we can do is really bring that that aesthetic appeal, that sense of shade, that sense of uh, yeah, just a nicer looking environment than all concrete. So it is very aesthetic right now. Also, that it brings in it creates a habitat for birds. It brings in
Yes.
other sense of life. I mean, besides human beings, you do realize that there are other, living beings habiting the environment. So that is what it brings to cities: butterflies, birds, insects. So yeah, right now that role is a little superficial or a little aesthetic. But having said that, that's equally important. I don't think that's not important. It is the green streets in the city are always the most favored. The open spaces, they're always where people go to. So they become go-to spaces when you can't take your office environs anymore. When you find the travel very difficult, you go search for solace in these green spaces. So I think it's a very important role that landscape plays. Regarding the lockdown, I think let one of the others comment. I
Yeah, ma'am, absolutely. I just wanted to add one point. When we are talking about the lockdown period, so during lockdown, we realized that importance of our terraces. Okay, and they are really our friends. It become, I mean, in that days, lockdown days. So if we calculate our rooftops, so our rooftops are near about at least 10% of the total urban area. So
yeah.
and maximum rooftops remain blank. Okay, so if we can convert the terraces into green roof, okay, maybe terrace garden or a vegetable garden, we'll get a lot of benefits out of that. So first of all, we are reducing stormwater runoff. Secondly, we are reducing heat gain. Thirdly, we are producing a lot of foods in terms of vegetables and fruits. And fourthly, that we are bringing ecology and wildlife back. Okay, and again, we are creating additional spaces, improving microclimate, and definitely we are reducing heat island curve. So it's very important to, I mean, post COVID situation, we can think in that way. And definitely government building rules can, I mean, need to be amended, and we, as the architects, have to take initiative for that, I think.
I'll just interject and ask you to explain for the benefit of the viewers what the heat island curve or the heat island effect and the heat gain coefficient that you were talking about. Can you just explain the
Yeah,
terms?
see, the heat gain curve is, if you search for heat island effect, you will get a curve. Okay, so curve basically you can draw a curve from a village to urban area. Okay, and you are getting a sine curve, something curve like a sine curve. So sine curve, the peak point is in urban area where the surface heat surface, I mean the concrete surface area is more. Okay, so heat gain is more in that area. So if we can reduce the concrete area by incorporating green rooftops, so definitely the curve can reduce.
All right. Kavita ma'am, what do you think about
I,
this?
yeah. So regarding the first part of your question, I think we do need to look at our urban. I totally agree with what Shilpa said, that it is because we have ignored, that we have come to a situation which is actually like a huge disaster, the urbanized areas. And especially in COVID, I think we realized that because of the nature of urbanization, the risks have also, we could understand the risks so much, that they become larger. So, of course, in terms of, we've already done a huge mistake. And if we really look back in time, before industrialization, hmm, originally man's footprints were more like inhabiting nature. Even if we look at Incas, the Machu
Right.
Picchu or whatever, the way man interacted with nature, originally it was all landscape, the entire earth. But the way man interacted with nature was more like, in harmony in terms of what are the needs of this species, of the human species, which were fitted with the natural resources and the understanding of the natural resources. So I think with industrialization came the agent of destruction of such a magnitude that it really bulldozed the entire landscape. And in fact, with industrialization, our greed actually overtook everything else. So, our entire way of looking at things was more like a consumerist, like we
Right.
just want to consume everything. And that is what led to our urbanized, the degraded landscapes rather. So, of course, as a landscape architect, one is to understand this process, which we have actually brought about, and how to mitigate it, as Shilpa was saying, as Sujoy was saying. I think I also, like as I said earlier about the green infrastructure approach. So there are basically some principles, and one of the principles is about looking at the stormwater management, and of course the
Yes.
second principle is about urban reforestation or urban forestry, and of course the third principle is also about urban agriculture or having food security at a neighborhood level. So I think these are very basic kind of things that we can actually think about now to mitigate. And here I would like to quote from Ian McHugh. There's like I was reading his writings. So we are familiar with the, that rhyme Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Yeah.
Right.
And of course it fell down and it shattered into so many pieces that you can't put together a shattered egg back. So what has actually happened is that the way sciences have actually scientists rather, all the fields of science have become very isolated, whether it is physics, chemistry, biology, ecology, geology, hydrology. Everyone works in their own, like almost putting what do you say, the horses, those things which cover their eyes, like they're
Right.
just focused on their own realm without actually looking at the interconnectedness of all these realms. So what is required, I think, is that landscape architects can actually become those stewards where they can, link the causalities between all these sciences.
So, so would all of you agree that in today's time, anyone who is a landscape architect or is looking to be a landscape architect needs to have an inherent responsibility towards mitigating climate change, or can someone be like a casual landscape architect, think on very superficial terms and still do well?
Inherently, one needs to love nature. And of course, it is very important to look at one's role as a very crucial role to mitigate climate change disaster. And apart from that, what I said is that there may be, people who are not interested in, going down to the essence, but maybe interested more in terms of the, superficial aspects of landscape as it is practiced nowadays. But I think we definitely need to dig deeper, because if we dig deeper, there is not a single human being who will be moved by nature. So I think we need to really connect at that level.
Yeah, Indranil, I just wanted to add one more point that nowadays landscape architecture sounds pretty exciting, and obviously it is, but it's probably also be a little challenging job. After all, it requires a quality diverse skill set. You know, just like for example, you have to be sensitive enough to landscape quality and understanding the arts and humanities approach to design, and obviously ability to analyze problems in terms of design and physical form, and technical competence definitely is more important nowadays to translate design into built work, and skills for skills in community engagement and multidisciplinary collaboration is important, and knowledge of human behavior, definitely botany, geography, and most importantly ecology that Kavita ma'am says, the climate change is very important, I guess.
I agree with what both of them are saying, but I also feel that, and here again I speak as a converted landscape architect, I think there is so much joy in our work that you can begin as a very superficial, whatever you call it, or commercial. But I think over the years, it's impossible to not become sensitive towards these issues. You just grow into that person. And, I have been very actively associated with the Indian Society of Landscape Architects. So I have come across, I think, 600 to 700 landscape architects in the last 8 years because of my engagement with Isola. And I have really not found a purely commercial, superficial landscape architect. I think all of us are touched by the subject eventually, sooner or later. If you begin as a very sensitive, aware soul, then your job is faster. But the subject just draws you towards itself. You have to be a little business smart if you want to make money. You have to, of course, have project management skills to deliver good projects, to have repeat clients. I mean, those are skills which go nowhere. I mean, as running a practice, even as an architect or any artist, you need those skills as well. But the knowledge of the subject itself, um, I think you're already 5 steps ahead of everyone else. So yeah, I love my profession and my subject. So that's what I have to say about it.
I think she speaks for all of us.
That's great. So I think just to, go towards the lighter part of this conversation, and since ma'am is a converted architect and the other two of you also work very closely with the architects, has it ever happened that you have been, called upon a project as a landscape architect, visited the site and felt, I wish the architect had done a better job?
I'm the wrong person.
Well, in a slightly different way, I have come across architects telling me that, well, we have already done so much. What is your role now? And I've just been quiet, and I tried to, play along that, okay, trying to just, not trying to justify. But of course, once I've started working, that they have been surprised that what landscape architect can actually bring about and how the site planning itself can be changed. So I have very often locked horns uh, about trying to change the site plan because feeling convinced that it will deliver a better kind of environment. And sometimes I have been successful.
No, we like Kavita said, we have. I think most of us would have, opposed or not opposed, but have had different opinions on the way architects have approached sites, especially the sloping ones, the more challenging ones. Having said that, we do understand that architects also operate under tremendous limitations. There are certain budgetary limitations. There are certain norms that they have to follow. There are certain square feet which have to necessarily be built. Um, but I do feel, and I think we are striving, we're striving day and night to be invited to participate in projects as early as possible, because I do feel that landscape architects have a better understanding of land, of siting, of even regional landscape behavior. So nothing against architects, but I just feel that a more holistic view in the beginning of the project would be more helpful. So I think we do what we can depending on whatever stage of a project we get involved, but it's always would earlier would be better. So
I totally second that. It's very well expressed.
Absolutely, absolutely true. No, it's, it's absolutely true because when we are working in a hill station, so I noticed that a lot of problem with. I mean, architects are not suitable with hilly site because the slope lands, the drainage, okay, then ecology. So they are not suitable with. With that site. Thanks.
the thing is that again, not to blame architects. See, today we have technology at our disposal to such an extent that you can even build skyscrapers on hills and on in hill stations. The thing is to understand whether that is really required. So I think if you can work with the land, with the soil, with the vegetation, with the climate, you don't need to oppose any of this just to prove that technology can handle all of this. So I think it's just that. I think our approaches are slightly different. We approach it from the existing natural systems point of view. Somebody may approach it from, I can prove it that it's possible point of view. So I think sometimes just respecting each other's skills would result in a better project. So yeah, I think that's what we need to learn to do.
So, in just continuing along similar lines, do you think it can stem back to the fact that the way we talk about the subject when we are in the phase of education for landscape architects or landscape architecture for that matter, and also the current system of education, the way it works, if you are like you guys were saying, if you are a landscape architect, you're also an architect. But would it be a better situation per se if we open up this field to people, let's say, who have a background in botany, or you have a background in these sciences, who can come together and maybe collaborate with people who have background in design and architecture to form something which is much more varied in terms of the skill set that we are using.
I think it is worth exploring. I have been associated with bachelors in landscape architecture in Sri Lanka, which is a 4-year bachelor's in landscape architecture. And it is, the course is basically REBA's uh, directions, REBA's guidelines. And that is the Royal Institute of British Architects. So the way it is structured is for it to be for the students to gain a very multidisciplinary kind of a knowledge. So they do get in a lot of botanists and ecologists and geomorphologists and all to kind of interact with the students in a very close manner, not in just giving them a knowledge of the subject, but in order for them to understand their site with in that respect. So I think while that is also a good way of approaching it, I think even getting people from different backgrounds to come and train as landscape architects, that is also something which I think we should be open about.
So internationally, you don't necessarily have to be an architect to do landscape architecture. There are people from various fields who participate. So that is definitely something which can be done. Also, like I think that would help for sure. But having said that, since we are not at the moment doing that, I think there can be a slight improvement in architectural teaching where the subject of landscape is concerned. Right now, it's sometimes there are some BArch courses which don't even have the subject all 5 years. There are some where it's a 6 month elective, and there are some universities where it's a 1 year, third year or fourth year, somewhere you have that subject, and it's more of a site plan rendering subject. So I think if it is taught also a little better in BArch education, it might still, help. So yes, while I always feel it's good to have people from other disciplines, but till we reach there, I think we can at least teach it better in the BArch level.
I just wanted to add. I totally agree with Shilpa ma'am. But to be very honest, I it hardly requires a degree to practice landscape architecture. Yes, for some big government projects, we have to show the degree. But otherwise, if you know your job very well and if you are confident enough to do the job, it hardly requires a degree.
What's your job
For
then?
example, what's my job is
Yeah, what's the job of the
That's a
landscape
little
architect that you're talking about?
controversial statement.
yes, ma'am. Just we just discussed about that of
Yeah.
you have to know about the climatology. You have to consider all the ecological part into landscape design and the other things.
No, that's what I mean. When Indranil says that you don't have to be a landscape architect, that's why I'm asking him, what does a landscape architect have to do, which anybody can do?
Ma'am, I can give you one example that just eco park in our Kolkata. I mean, in our city is the largest park that is around 700 acres of land. So the master planner was not a landscape architect, and even part landscape was done by other architects. So and it was beautifully done. I mean, the aesthetic wise and the climate. I mean, the ecological wise. So you don't have to be a landscape architect. If you are sensible enough, I think if we can create the job.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask that Eco Park is part of the new town.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, so of course I have kind of been to the new town area in Kolkata, and this is one thing which I do, want to bring about when we talk about smart cities. Newtown was one of the examples of the smart city. Hmm? So, of course, I think there is a basic, flaw in the way we are approaching smart cities because it is making cities faceless. Because all the smart cities are following a certain guideline which is more technology based, and it is kind of standardized, and we are losing the cultural or the natural fabric, the character or the sense of place, which is originally felt or experienced because of the way nature is. I think that is the flaw even in New Town, because of course the eco park may have like certain criteria of say entertainment of people, but it is more like but it is more like an amusement park. It is not really like an ecological park. So I think that is where the difference lies when a landscape architect who has been sensitized to design in accord with nature actually comes into the role, and where other people who have not been sensitized to this try and take up that role, because then they take it up in a very what do you say, the soul is kind of missing then, huh? So so that is my opinion about it, and I think I really feel that smart cities have a lot of means it's a hype, and they are really missing that essential soul. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, would you also agree with the statement that, especially in the case of smart cities, we sometimes have a problem of looking at things that have worked abroad and blatantly copying them in India without addressing the Indian context?
So I think
Yeah.
again here the problem is the wrong people taking the wrong decisions. If you ask a landscape architect whether, this is the ecological park, he or she may have a different take on it. Similarly, if you ask a politician that should Bombay look like Shanghai, he or she may have a different opinion on it. So I think it's very important that we respect professional expertise, and the right people evaluate and take the right decisions. And also that nothing, we understand that everything is interconnected. Today, when you put a metro in a city, you can't ignore the road network. When you put up a new flyover, you can't ignore, the housing which is along it. When you build a housing, you can't ignore the nala which is running over there. So I think the lesson, definitely copying from the West, or according to me, even copying from another city in India, in North India to South India, also doesn't work. It's very important that case to case there is an evaluation by the right people with the right professional expertise, and then you're going to have the right solutions. So we either consider only economics, or we consider only aesthetics, or we consider only imageability, and we take decisions which are very incomplete in their total understanding.
We need to have a set of principles, and when we follow principles, then we don't copy, but we put the principles to the situation and we come up with a unique solution. So I think that is what is important. So even when we study history, whether it is history of architecture, history of landscape, history of whatever, what is important is that we glean the principles that we have understood in the process and we take it forward. Because if we just copy as it is, then we are just going by a superficial understanding. So I think it is very important to so there it comes into force, like whatever we discussed right from the beginning, that we start from the essence of man's place in this web of life, and we look at landscape as an interconnected forces which are in play, and then how do we actually kind of harmonize ourselves into this interconnected forces that are actually playing around. So if we that is where I talk about the green infrastructure approach also. Basically, it is very important that we recognize all these forces in play. And one thing, of course, I did want to, I was quite inspired by something which one a professional urban designer called Mr. Shyam Khandekar had expressed in terms of, he called it the art of simultaneous design. So I think what Shilpa was talking about, this kind of expresses it, that when we look at different layers, say layers of landscape, flora and fauna, humans, which is pedestrians, communities, public transport, private automobiles, and infrastructure, which means all kinds of amenities, services like oil, pipe, electrical, water, waste, telecom, etc. All these kind of interact together. So when we look at these layers, and so when we design, we don't overlook any layer, but it is like an art of simultaneous design. So what is happening is, when the focus becomes singular, that is where the problem arises, rather than the focus is multi-layered. Because say if it is just an engineering point of view, then we overlook especially the layers which cannot speak and which are most susceptible or vulnerable, which is of the landscape flora fauna, because they cannot speak. So that is where our role as human beings, as being the managers of the biosphere, becomes important, because our consciousness, as where we understand how all layers interact, that consciousness becomes very important as to what our actions will be like. So this is what I would like to, add to this conversation.
So, while we were talking about parks and large public spaces, for most of the people who are, let's say, watching this episode, let if we were to bring it down to their scale, let's say we bring it down to their terraces or their balconies. So, as landscape architects, what would be your very simple advices, or just what we call nuske in Hindi? What would be your something that you can tell them if they want to bring that element of nature into their homes?
If you're looking for your home, so first you have to identify the space where we can add some green. Okay, and what are the open space we can find? So first of all, the terrace that we can add value. I mean, add landscape, and secondly, in your indoor. So we know few indoor plants that can improve your air quality. Okay, so that kind of plants definitely we can add into our landscape. And secondly, we can use our terrace as landscape, not only for the aesthetic things. Also, if you can produce vegetables, nowadays a lot of techniques are available. Just for example, organic farming and hydroponics farming is definitely one of the new concept that is coming up, that enhances, that encourage you to soil-less farming. Definitely. So I think these are the things you can definitely think of.
Having a small garden of your own, or having a terrace garden, or whatever, indulging in any form of landscaping is actually like having a baby or having a pet dog or something. Jitna, as much as you look after it, it's going to give you back. So I wouldn't advise anybody to go buy 10 pots, water them for 10 days, and then on the 11th day, forget about it. So the thing with landscape is it is as much alive as we are as human beings. So it needs nurturing, it needs care, it needs nutrition, it needs protection from weather. It just, you just can't expect it to give you everything while you give it nothing. So I think this is the thing. I sometimes feel sad when people, just go buy lots of plants. And I live in a society, 8-storied apartment, and after 3 months you'll find all these pots, half dead plants downstairs because they've abandoned them. So I feel it's not easy, but it is very very fulfilling. So as much as you give it, double that it will give you back. So that's my advice.
I think they've said it all.
Okay. Um, so, coming back to the whole sphere of education for someone who is, let's say, currently in their fifth year of bachelor's in architecture, and are thinking about whether or not landscape is a field that they want to explore, what would be your one thing that you can tell them which would make it easier for them to take that decision? And as a continuation to that, do you think landscape is something that anyone can pursue of all the people who are graduating architecture?
I think people should look at becoming more wholesome architect through pursuing landscape architecture. I think that should be the goal. And while saying that, current scenario is such that you kind of get compartmentalized. But in essence, I have come across architects who have pursued landscape architecture and have become very sensitive architects as such. And I have basically, as an example, I know of a couple of them in practicing in Sri Lanka. And I think Sri Lankan architects, by and large, my impression of them is that they are very sensitive architects and landscape architects, taking even the example of Geoffrey Bawa. No? So, in essence, when we look at, traditionally, when we look at, we say that building inside and then outside environment, external environment. So, by having that perception, we create a divide, that environment is separate from us. But in actuality, it is not inside and outside. So if we kind of, have that perception, which is, a different perception where we are actually interlinked, we look at the interconnectedness of us and the environment, then I think when we build buildings and the way we look at site, the site development and building no longer becomes like separate compartments. And this is what I would say should be the goal of pursuing landscape architecture. This is my take.
So
Yeah.
I think young graduates or people about to graduate should definitely pursue landscape architecture for post graduation, because I think this is the one field which exposes you to a very, very large range of projects. I mean, you could be doing, from a terrace to a residential, a farmhouse to a residential complex to commercial healthcare projects right up to city level infrastructure projects. So this field allows you to understand and use your skills at all these scales. It brings you in contact with various industries, various professions, different types of people, which also architecture does, but this is still far more grounded. And and the day India reaches where the rest of the world is, in the rest of the world, especially the Western world, the landscape architect is the master planner. He's the leader of the project. He or she determines, like it lays out the base plan for a project. So when we reach that level of understanding, this will probably be one of the most engaging professions to be in. So I think for students, this is a great place to be. I mean, a great profession to be. And you don't have to quit your architecture practice. You can offer an alternative. I mean, you can also offer landscape design services. You can. There's a fair bit of planning, environmental planning that you will learn. So it's very, very holistic. So I would encourage any young graduate to get into it. And also, to answer your question about can anyone be a landscape architect? No, I don't believe. I mean, or rather, can anyone practice landscape architecture? I don't think so. I mean, you can do your terrace and your little garden, but I think you need the core knowledge to address the larger projects and to make that larger impact. So, um, yeah, I think with that little basic love for the subject, and I would encourage any student to go ahead and do a postgraduate degree in landscape.
Yeah, as in landscape architect, he will have to get the opportunity to make an impact on the world's experience of outdoor spaces and have endless way and places to do so. And if you are looking for a creative career path, definitely you should join landscape architecture, and you will get the opportunity to design in diverse way. Okay, with very variety of mediums, and you will get opportunity to design with healthier lives. Okay, designing with natural elements, historical preservation, and I think wildlife conservation and community improvement. that kind of thing,
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah. Imagine every site visit is a vacation
Yeah,
to a nature reserve. You're always dealing with, soil and plants and birds and butterflies. And you're in rural India. You get to travel so much. And every time you go back to your site, it's growing, it's beautiful. It's like, it's amazing. I think everyone should strive to be a landscape architect.
Right. So before we go to the very last question, the second last question, which is that so when we are talking about very famous architects in India or in the world, or as they are called, star architects, we hardly hear the name of a landscape architect. So what does that how does that feel for someone who's the part of the community of landscape architects?
I think our profession is still getting, in the process of being recognized. So it is still a young profession. So though, within our community, we are, like say, Sujoy has worked with Professor Shahir, I have worked with Professor Shahir, and all three of us have studied under Professor Shahir. So we are, like aware of, kind of great landscape architects. But I'm sure like the way the star architects are well known, the landscape architects may not be that well known, primarily because it is still a young field. That is my understanding of it.
Yeah, as opposed to the lakhs and lakhs of architects that we have, this count we had done 2 years back, there were only 1,200 landscape architects in India from the time the course in SPA Delhi was started. So I think the sheer numbers right now, I mean, we're just not enough of us, uh, and people just don't know what we do. So, like Kavita said, it's a very nascent profession here in the country. So, uh, having said that, sometimes you have this a large tree, and you always go stand. Suppose it's near a bus stop, and you go stand under it every time. You don't realize that you're going and standing under it for the shade of the tree. The day you chop off the tree or remove the tree is when you understand what it was giving you. I think our profession is right now at that stage. We are working very invisibly towards making things better. We have probably not brought ourselves also, to the forefront, not attempted to. Maybe we should, because that's the only way the profession will grow and draw more, younger people towards it. But I think right now we are working very invisibly in this thing. So yeah, not too many star landscape architects for the world, but we know some phenomenal stars in our own heart. We know
yes,
people
definitely.
uh, who have made tremendous impact on the way we think and the way we learned the subject.
Okay, so I think to wrap up this with the last question, which I know, I'll get a lot of text messages saying why I didn't ask this, if I didn't go ahead and ask this. So, if someone is a student or a young graduate who's looking to start a career in landscape architect, what are the first steps according to you?
So I think, like I said earlier, if you are already an architect, I mean, you will always, anyways, be an architect before you become a landscape architect. But if you're already practicing architecture, a good way to start would be to, you know, uh, add value to your own projects, so that people know that you are able to deliver more than what just an architect is able to deliver. That's one uh, way. I mean, if you are already having architecture projects. The other way is, it always helps to work in a landscape firm and understand, because, like, the way landscape projects operate is slightly different from the way architecture projects do. you draw your landscape plans when a project begins, then 2 years the building is being built, and then 3 years later you're called on to do the landscape. So it's very different from the way an interior or an architecture project works. So if you work in a landscape firm, you're likely to learn the processes much faster with lesser mistakes
Yes.
than you would if you were doing it on your own. So I would definitely suggest a year of, at least a year of working with a very sound firm where design basics, details are in place. And then I think the profession is so young and so few of us there that there's enough work. People will call you, and you can start learning. You can take part in competitions. You can work with architects. It always helps, since again all of us are architects. You're bound to have some batchmates, seniors, juniors who are running their own practices. You can start working with them, and or when I say with them, I mean on their projects, consulting on their projects as landscape architects. So I think a little bit of networking, a lot of learning under a master would help. And yeah, I think basically being an architect is also extremely helpful because you're already well versed with quantities, with details, with costing, with technical specifications. So in that sense, you already know enough.
Right. So, before we move on to the others, I'll also add one question to you, ma'am, and also Sujay sir and Kavita ma'am, when you guys are answering. If someone is looking to get a position in your firm, what are you looking at?
Well, I look at the desire to learn and the desire to work hard, because both go hand in hand. And of course, I think creativity does play a very important role. That you basically, I'm looking at somebody who is very serious about learning. Huh? I think that becomes the most important point for me.
Sincerity is more important for me. The person should be sincere, and he must have interest in landscape architecture. So that is the main thing for me. Sincerity.
See, we get different kinds of people applying. So there are interns who apply. So interns, I usually have a look at their drawings or their thesis or whatever. It's very, very clear, whether the person has that bent of mind or not by looking at one drawing. So we don't refuse interns. If they have that little aptitude, they are most welcome to spend their, 3-4 months with us. Then there are architects who are little confused. Should I do landscape? Should I not do landscape? So they decide I'll work for 6 months and then decide. So these people are going to leave. So at that point, I just look for honesty. That don't lie. Be honest about it. You're here to learn. So if they are genuinely talented with the aptitude again, which is very very visible, through their drawings and the way they talk, so we do take them in, but then we know that this is a short-term thing. So even the projects they are onto are of that scale and that kind of a time. And then there are these people who are ever so rare, whom you are looking that they'll be with you for forever for good, take care of your project and your firms. That's very very
Yes.
rare. But we've been lucky. We've been very very lucky to have a couple of, and I think you get such people like a couple of them in. And you also have to be earning enough to be able to do justice to them and pay them what they deserve. So those people are really rare. And yeah, that it's either some good intern who goes, does his or her masters and comes back and joins you. Then and there are always people whom you align with and they align to your thinking. So I think, yeah, it's a different stages what we look for, but basically an aptitude which is very very you don't have to do much. You can look at a drawing and talk to a person and know. I look at honesty of purpose of being in the firm, as you know.
So, that kind of brings us to the end of it. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.